Welcome to the Psychology of Black Womanhood podcast, the space where research meets the real world. I am Latricia Robinson, and in this episode, we're looking at Black women's roles in providing formal and informal end-of-life care. Black women have played a crucial role in providing supportive end-of-life care in our communities. There is a large body of work documenting the ways in which they offer emotional, spiritual, and practical assistance to individuals facing their final days. In the Black community, where death and dying are often stigmatized topics, Black women have consistently stepped up to fill the gap in end-of-life care. They provide comfort and companionship to those nearing the end of their life journey, offering a listening ear and a compassionate presence during this difficult time. Today we are speaking with Joelle Simone Maldonado, also known as the Grave Woman. She is a sacred end-of-life and grief care professional, award-winning educator, and founder of the Black Death, Grief, and Cultural Care Academy. Today she shares with us the ways in which she offers culturally sensitive care that resonates with clients on a deeper level, including honoring tradition and rituals, and supporting meaningful end-of-life experience.
Technically, this topic is something that people are nervous about talking about. And actually, why don't we start off by why do you use that term, the grave woman?
The name, honestly, is kind of a lengthy story, so I'll try to cut it as much as I can. So I drew a picture here in my grandmother's house back in 1994 of myself talking to and from the graves. And it said, "I am the grave woman." That's what I wrote on the picture. Dated September 11th, 1994. Fast forward to 2011, I'm in mortuary school. I'm going through some items with my sister, and we find a scrapbook that my grandmother made as a gift for me when I graduated high school. And she finds a picture, that picture that I drew that said, "I am the grave woman."
Wow.
The funny part is when I started mortuary school, I started a blog called The Grave Woman as an outlet, an emotional and psychological outlet. It was the moniker that I made up for myself. I think people remember Blogspot. That was my Blogspot and my brand in my mind. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that I had when I was a child at 8 years old, that my grandmother just happened to save a picture that happened to be the name of my blog and brand, that happened to be found and happens to be who I am now.
That's such a chilling and a powerful story. How did you move into the pathway of doing mortuary school, even with that kind of narrative floating around, I'm assuming, in your mind and in your energy?
Definitely. So my uncle Mark, he was a master mortician and funeral director when I was a little girl. And I would be obsessed with everything he did. I wanted to know what happened to the bodies when they pass away. Why are we looking at these people sleeping in these caskets? This is in my child mind. He would answer all of my questions. And eventually I begged him to take me to the funeral home with him. And my parents and grandparents agreed that it would get it out of my system and I could go back to being a normal child and stop thinking about death. But I fell in love. That morbid curiosity turned into research and helping my uncle out whenever I could at the funeral home, to deciding this is what I wanted to do.
I'm glad you used that term, morbid curiosity, because I think that's how most of us think about death, as it's something morbid or scary. As I shared with you earlier, having gone through several peers of my age dying in the last decade, it seems like it's a big, scary step. How did you get over this, or how do you work through this in terms of moving through this with your career, and particularly as a Black woman?
Ooh. So I think that's a huge misconception. And that's such a great question, that we as death care professionals don't have fears about death. I think the thing that helps me the most or the thing that helped me conquer my fear the most, was educating myself about death, about what happens when we die, what happens at the funeral home, and becoming the person that cares for people when they pass away. In addition to that, I am of Gullah and Geechee descent, and conversations about death aren't kept from children. We're very much so involved in the death, dying, and celebration of life process in our communities. My mother and grandmothers were a part of what's called the Missionary Society in church when I was growing up. And so I spent a lot of time around elderly people that were transitioning early in life. when at about 5, 6 years old, I lost my best friend in a tragic accident. She was playing hide and go seek with her brother, got into the trunk of an old Range Rover or Land Rover, and got into the compartment where the tire used to be, the spare tire used to be, and she suffocated. And so I was introduced to not only loss, but tragic loss at a very young age, and have had several or been of support to friends and family who have had tragic losses throughout my life. So I think all of that, just combined with my own spiritual beliefs and experiences, it helps me navigate. I won't say it's taken those fears or those reservations away. Specifically as a Black woman, again, leaning more so into my cultural upbringing and understanding of life is temporary. Everything is temporal, and we are indeed a part of a cycle of life, has also led to some of that comfort as well.
Can you maybe talk about the ways in which you think your Gullah culture played into where you are today and the work that you're doing?
Definitely. So for those who aren't familiar, the Gullah and Geechee culture refers to a specific cultural demographic that is prevalent from Florida to the coast of North Carolina. And what makes where I'm from, Beaufort, South Carolina, so unique is because about 96% of people with African lineage or blood flowing through their bodies here in the United States can trace their lineage to literally my backyard, which is the Port Royal Sound, which is where we were brought as enslaved people to the United States of America. And so that alone, that history, that culture, that language, that food, that music, all of that is very much so alive in the spirit of this area, in the culture that we live in and exist in every day. And so with that comes a lot of our authentic and original belief systems around death, around grief, around transition, and around the afterlife, around ancestral veneration, around communicating with spirits, around recognizing and being able to foresee death and grief.
Could you describe your exact title and what it means in terms of your training and what you do?
Definitely. I am a licensed funeral director and embalmer. I'm also a licensed insurance agent, which means that I can care for people when they pass away as a funeral director and embalmer. I take care of your body when you pass away through the art of embalming. As an insurance agent and a funeral director, I help people pre-plan for end of life and death care services in the form of making funeral arrangements, getting life insurance, burial insurance, and securing the financial aspect. I educate about all the things that I've shared, but most important part of my work is as a sacred grief care practitioner. And what that means is that I'm not a licensed psychologist or psychiatrist or mental health professional. However, I incorporate my culture, professional experience, and intuitive knowledge to help people navigate and alchemize their grief journey into purpose.
I think that's really important that we highlight that sometimes maybe a counselor or a therapist isn't the right person's role at this moment.
Definitely, especially as a Black woman or Black person navigating this journey of life. A lot of times in our community, when someone passes away, we're taught to pray away grief, or this is just what you go through. You're going through your season or whatever. And we don't seek mental health resources. And that's where someone like myself, who maybe isn't licensed, comes in, and we have real life conversations. We cry, we cuss, we cut up. I give you tips and tricks, or I give you my intuitive insight about what you're going through just based on my professional experience as a paraprofessional.
Maybe you could talk about how death is unique in the Black community and as a culture.
Oh my gosh, so many ways. Well, it's so crazy you ask this question, but I don't think that people think about what we do, especially in the Black community, as ritualistic as it pertains to celebration of life or end of life. There are rituals that take place. Let's say someone dies, from the removal, starting with the removal, which is where we as death care professionals come in and remove a person from the place that they've passed away. That in itself is a ritual, because if that person were to stay there, we have biohazards. A lot of people aren't comfortable with a dead body being in in the living room or the bedroom. And so the ritual of having someone, a group of people or persons come into your home and remove your loved one and take them into your care is a ritual. The last exit from the home, especially here in my culture, this is the last time that the physical body of that person is going to be in the home, and removing them from that home is a ritual, and it should be approached and handled in such a way. And as the professional, taking custody of your loved one's body is a ritual for me because I'm now responsible for that person. Rituals performed by death doulas when someone is in the midst of transition, bathing. A lot of times, these are the last baths or cleansings that someone is going to receive while they're alive. That's a ritual. Feeding. A lot of times people lose their appetite. So you're, in retrospect, giving someone their last meal. That's a ritual. Holding space in itself, just being there and being present and helping family members and loved ones and communities navigate through the death and dying process, which it truly is a process. There's steps to death and dying if we're privileged enough to die in the comfort of the care of our families and someone that cares for us. Rituals performed during the embalming process, setting the features is something that we do. A lot of times people think that the way that you look in your casket, how you look when you die, and it's not. We as professionals actually go through a restorative art process, which begins with closing your mouth, closing your eyes, positioning your hands and your head and your body in your casket, casketing a person, putting them in some type of receptacle where their body can be viewed and displayed with dignity and respect. Grooming, our hair, our cosmetic needs. There are just so many different rituals that are performed. Even going to the funeral home and making funeral arrangements in itself is a ritual because you're now taking on the responsibility of creating a celebration of life, lighting of candles, reading of Psalms and of Bible verses, singing songs. Literally celebration. And in my culture, we believe in clapping a lot during funeral and during celebrations of life, because that's invoking the spirit of God and the spirit of peace. We also perform something called passing by, where maybe the hearse and immediate family, other funeral goers in the procession will drive by the deceased home so that that physical body is driven through that neighborhood once again. Passing over, where we take children and infants and actually hand them over from one end of the casket to another so that that person's face can be ingrained in that child's memory. So when that spirit visits them in life through dreams or visitations, they have some type of recognition and they're not afraid. So, I mean, I could go on and on and on.
No, I'm listening to this. I think a lot of us, the pieces that you're talking about speak about the richness and the diversity of Black rituals around death. Because I think one of the more popular ones is what we see in New Orleans with the line at the end.
Second line, yeah.
Second line. And then you're talking about these traditions too. I've heard about the passing the babies over. What are the issues around cultural competency in your role when it comes to thinking about death and death rituals?
You can't talk about ritual and about cultural competency without addressing racism. Unfortunately, in standard mortuary science and healthcare education, which is essentially end of life education, the care of Black bodies is not discussed. When I was in mortuary school, we got taught how to care for Jewish people, for Catholic people, for white people, and that was about it. We even learned about Mormons. However, there was no discussion about caring for people that looked, spoke, prayed, and believed like me, which are Black people. And the diversity, even in Black culture, you have your Caribbean. Even when you're talking about the Caribbean and the islands, you could be East Island, West Island, and things like taking care of our hair, removing braids, caring for locks, caring for natural hair, something as simple as shampooing Black hair and understanding detangling and shrinkage. I've been in embalming room with seasoned professionals, one of which was cutting a woman's box braids from her scalp because the family said that they wanted her braids taken out. And in doing so, he didn't understand that he was essentially cutting all of her hair off. And so my answer to that has been the creation of the Black Death, Grief and Cultural Care Academy, in which I discuss all of these nuances and facets of Black death care. Even something like euphemisms understanding that when communicating with Black families and Black communities about death and grief, you may not get the formal answer about trust and estates and pre-planning and beneficiaries and things like that. However, there are language cues that are associated with end-of-life conversations. And if you're not a part of a Black community or have conversations with Black people on a daily basis, that you may miss as a professional. So even communicating with people about death, end of life, and transition.
So you've created an academy around this. Can you tell me what kinds of things you're teaching specifically? And also, what's been the response to this?
The academy officially launched last year, but I've been teaching courses since 2020. And the academy is dedicated to honoring, preserving, and sharing Black end of life, death, and grief care ceremony, rituals, and culture. And just to give you some idea of the things that we talk about shampooing, conditioning, and detangling Black hair, removing braids and other extensions, lock and twist care, cultural competency as it relates to Black hair and skin care for Black decedents. We talk about racism in death care and the barriers that exist between death care professionals who aren't familiar with Black culture, and teach them how to communicate and engage while understanding barriers, not appropriating culture, but being able to serve. We talk about spiritual funeral planning, because a lot of times when we as Black people talk about end of life, it's tied to religion and church. And so you have to approach the conversation with a spiritual context in many cases in order to be professional. We talk about disenfranchised grief, confronting bias, ignorance, and prejudice, and micro and macro aggressions within death care, and so many other things that are to come.
It goes beyond just a cultural competency. And so it sounds like it's really this whole holistic understanding that even myself, maybe as a Black woman, might not connect in the same ways without this type of knowledge of what you're addressing.
Definitely. And the academy is not meant only for non-Black participants or registrants or students. The academy is meant for anyone. Again, our mission and our value statement clearly says that we're preserving, we're honoring, and we're sharing. In Black culture, community is very important. The tribal mindset. And we exist within Black tribes and within Black communities. And our mission, again, is just to simply share, preserve, and honor.
How come we don't really talk about this last phase in a way that reflects who we are as Black men and women?
That is a very good question. I'm not sure I have the right answer, but my thought is that a lot of times we don't have the luxury to fantasize about what is referred to in my industry as this good death experience, right? We're navigating life, again, with those, I don't want to say limitations, but challenges already put on our shoulders from birth in many cases. And if they aren't put on our shoulders from birth, we go out into the world and have a very harsh reality check that we're othered in many ways. And so having to go through life and navigate that stigma of other while existing life and navigating loss through all of that, many times we just aren't afforded that luxury.
We just have gone through a major pandemic here in the United States. And even though we can say we've passed it, it was really impactful on the Black community in terms of deaths and in terms of the ways in which we look at health for Blacks in the United States. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the ways it might have impacted the death industry?
Definitely. And that's a really good question, because for the past few months, I've been a part of what is called the COVID-19 Oral History Project, which is being basically sponsored and put together by the Library of Congress. And the first round of interviews that we did was with the National Directors and Morticians Association, which is the professional funeral service education and community organization that was put together specifically for Black professionals. And in those interviews, we've talked and heard so much about the disparities in resources for Black communities, how much of a public health role funeral directors and morticians play, because our licenses come through the public health department, believe it or not. and how important our roles as Black death care professionals were, not only for public health and for the United States as a whole during the pandemic, but we were the resource for our communities, our Black communities. They looked to us for answers because they weren't believing what they were being told by medical professionals. And so being a part of this project with my mentor, who is actually the leader on our aspect, which focuses on death care, her name is Anita Grant. The question she and the team put together, and watching the interviews and seeing the emotions of Black death care professionals and hearing the stories told and how much we as professionals did during that time for our communities, not only emotionally, but from a public health standpoint, was phenomenal.
Could you maybe share some of your stories or your experiences during that period that were unique to you being a Black woman and serving the Black community?
Definitely. So during the COVID pandemic, I was actually working as a licensed funeral director and working for Emory University at the same time. Emory University was my full-time job. I was a part-time funeral director. And walking into a room where you normally see one or two or maybe three decedents, and seeing shelves have to be put up from the floor to the ceiling because that's how many people are coming into the funeral homes, or serving the same family multiple times in a week, or having to tell families, we simply cannot take your loved one into our care, was the experience that I had. Interestingly enough, I got COVID, and at that time also began teaching courses. And so my career transitioned from being in the funeral home and on ground zero, so to speak, to using my knowledge and experience to educate others about caring for Black families. Because what COVID did was, traditionally, especially here in the South, Black people go to Black funeral homes, white people go to white funeral homes. Like I said, we had to tell families that we don't have the capacity to take you into our care. So what that did was disturb that segregation in the family's choice, or in the funeral home's desire to serve communities other than what their race represented. And so Black people were going into white funeral homes to make arrangements. That means Black decedents were going into the care of more white professionals who didn't know how to culturally relate to us, how to care for our hair, care for our cosmetic needs, cosmetize and perform restorative arts in a way that reflects our specific needs.
What were some of the major findings or things from this project that you think are going to sort of help the industry moving forward?
The major theme that we saw was our dependence on technology during the pandemic and now moving forward. COVID changed the way that we do funerals. Prior to COVID, the family had to wait days, maybe weeks before we can get the family together to make arrangements, let alone plan a service. During COVID, you had 24 to 48 hours to plan a service, have your loved one buried, and hopefully your family could catch it on Zoom. Many funeral homes, especially in the Black community that are not corporately owned, are owned by older owners, or are owned by older owners who didn't incorporate things like DocuSign or stream funerals. Or we had, from the religious context, was the pastor's time to shine, right? Many times pastors were not opening their churches for funerals. So the funeral directors became the pastors and the eulogizers. So now people don't necessarily depend on their pastors to eulogize their loved ones. They'll either figure out how to have someone in the family do it themselves, or ask us as death care professionals for that moment. Funeral times have been cut in half. We used to spend 3 to 4 hours on a Tuesday at a funeral. Now, if your funeral is 45 minutes long and you have 10 people there, you're doing something amazing, because now people are saying, you know what, I'm not traveling across the country. I haven't seen Aunt Betty in 40 years. Just send me the Zoom information. So that's been a theme. The theme about self-care and what we as professionals do to care for ourselves has been very strong. Themes about putting ourselves on the front line meant that we separated ourselves from our families and our support systems, because we were the ones dealing with the blood and dealing with the bodies of those that have passed away. Again, the importance of our public health role was a consistent consistent theme. This batch of interviews was one of 3. So we have 2 more rounds of interviews to perform. So like I said, our project ends in August of 2024. And I believe the Library of Congress will be publishing it shortly after. And it's called the COVID-19 Oral History Project. And ours is specific, again, to the funeral and death care industry.
I am so looking forward to looking at that. And I'm so glad you shared that information with us, because I think that gave insights that, we talked about all the deaths, but we didn't really think about the ways in which people in your role had to sort of navigate that, like you said, as a public health issue, as a social issue, as a political issue. So I think that's really powerful. People who realize that they have to help someone transition, or they're in this final phase of the transition, how can they gain the knowledge or know how to ask the right questions about the things that you've been talking about?
Definitely. So I'll answer that question from 3 different perspectives. As a person caring for someone in transition, advocate for what is right. Like, what are your human rights? You have the right to be treated with respect and dignity. And if something happens that causes you to feel or think that you're not being treated that way, I want to say make demands, but challenge that. Ask to speak to someone, or there's several resources out there. Free information. YouTube is like a whole free academy. Look up how should someone be treated at the end of their life. Tips for death doulas, or tips from death doulas. There are so many people out there that have so many resources. A few that come to mind are Alua Author, who has her academy, Going with Grace, where she teaches and trains death doula, but she also on social media has videos talking about end of life and her experience as a death doula and the lessons she learns, and sharing information that way. There are books out there. She has one of them that's coming out in April. I'm using her because she's another Black woman that's doing amazing work in that vein. As someone who is planning end of life arrangements or making funeral arrangements for someone who has passed away or in transition, again, YouTube, how to plan a funeral. I, in a sense, am everywhere because I'm online on YouTube and podcasts and all those things. But again, maybe I'm not the person that you'll resonate with, but there's several people out there that talk about this. And as someone, as a professional seeking information about how to care for people in a dignified and respectful way, there are academies like mine and others that exist for that very purpose.
What do you think is something that the Black community can learn from you and your family and your culture about the type of work that you do?
That's a really good, you hit me with these really good questions. Let me take a moment and kind of sit with that. What I hope people can learn, and what I believe, is that we each come here with something. We come here with an assignment, and it's my belief that you have to earn the right to die, right? It's just my personal belief. And I feel like a part of earning that right to die is becoming connected to and executing whatever that thing is that we come here with. And at the end of my life, I tell people all the time, I pray to die empty, meaning that I've fully exercise that thing that was put in me that led me to draw that picture and create that blog and be gifted with an uncle and gifted with a grandmother that kept it. Those are all pieces that are creating my bridge of life, so to speak. And so I pray that what people learn is that at the end of the day, somebody's going to tell a story about you. And many times I'm going to be the one to write it, or someone like me who's going to write your obituary. Let that obituary reflect what that thing is and tell that story. Some people call it a purpose or a mission or your reason for being alive. Let your obituary reflect that story.
That was the brave woman, Joelle Simone Maldonado, sharing her work and wisdom around the importance of cultural competency, racial inclusion and diversity, and end-of-life, death, and grief care. To find out more about Ms. Maldonado, including assessing her course information and social media handles, go to this episode on our website podcast page. This podcast is part of the Psychology of Black Womanhood book resources, which is used for classroom and community engagement. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to show your love for the podcast, please leave a rating and a review. Similarly, if you would like to keep up with other projects, you can follow us on Instagram or Facebook. To check out all of our activities, visit our website, www.psychologyofblackwomanhood.com. Thanks for listening.